All right, we are back with contributing writer Jake Fogelman this week. He's back on the show, ironically from a trip that he's taking, but he's off last week. We had contributing editor Paul Crookston. Now we have Jake back on the show. Welcome back to the show, Jake.
Yeah, it's good to be back. As you can see, no guitars in the background. I'm in a hotel room here in Seattle, so it's good to be here.
Yes, thank you for doing the show. Paul is also traveling. He's in Alaska, I believe, already up there. So you are the the closer to high-speed internet, I guess, person on vacation. But you've also been writing pieces this week. So you've still got several stories up at the Reload. Both of them are on the same topic, right? The recent mall shooting in Indiana and the armed civilian who intervened to stop that shooting, to end it. Can you give us more details about what happened there?
Yeah, so most of you probably know by the time this comes out, but last Sunday there was as you said, a shooting. A young man walked into a mall just south of Indianapolis and just began open firing with a rifle. But now we know, because of police reports and some of eyewitness statements, that there was an armed bystander just happened to be at the mall. And then within 15 seconds, he drew his handgun and put the shooter down. And some of the details around, the timeline and sort of how the shooting broke down is pretty impressive. Apparently, the guy was, about 40 yards away from the shooter. And fired 10 rounds and hit the shooter 8 times. So pretty impressive marksman. This is a 22-year-old young man. Elijah Dicken is his name. So just unbelievable. Fortunately, he was there and likely saved many lives. Yeah,
and I believe their latest timeline from police indicates that he had started firing back within like a minute of the shooting beginning, which is pretty incredible. Also gives you sort of an insight, gives you some idea about how quickly these things can happen, because the attacker did manage to murder 3 people and injure 2 more. Right. He shot off about 20 rounds, I believe, from his rifle before Elijah Dicken, was able to respond using his own handgun. But yeah, certainly that high stress situation, long distance shooting, much longer than you might expect in a self-defense encounter. Those usually occur within, 7 yards. This is 40 yards. That's a long way, right? And he's got 8 hits out of 10 shots on a, moving target at that distance in that time frame is pretty remarkable shooting for somebody who. He didn't have any specialized training, no law enforcement or military training.
That's right.
He actually didn't even have a concealed carry permit. Interestingly, he benefited from the state's recent permitless carry legislation. It actually went into effect this month, and he was carrying legally without the need for a permit because he didn't have any, as far as we're aware, as far as police have told everyone, he didn't have any record that would keep him from being able to do so. And so he was able to end this shooting, and that's obviously caused quite a lot of stir in the political world, which is another thing that you've written about in the members piece. This sort of political response to what happened here. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so like you said in the piece, I kind of dub it. It's basically like a Rorschach test, right? It's however you view guns in general is sort of how you viewed this situation, it seems to me. So folks that aren't particularly fond of guns or would like to see more gun control laws really downplayed the actions of Eli in this case, almost to a shocking degree, at least early on. Well, you saw folks...
And you actually saw some people... attack him, more or less. I mean, that's, I don't know what other word you'd use for it. You had some gun control leadership publicly calling him labeling him a vigilante or implying that he was carrying illegally, which turned out not to be true. But most people were obviously happy about him being able to be there and taking action to save people's lives. The mall itself even praised his actions. The police praised his actions, called him a hero. But yeah, not and the NRA and gun rights groups have used this incident as evidence of the effectiveness of permitless carry or the good guy with a gun sort of trope. But yeah, certainly you've seen the opposite reaction in varying degrees. Now, look, I think most of the reaction on the gun control side was mainly just to ignore that this happened, or to say, ignore that he stopped the shooting and focus on the fact that this person still killed 3 people, which is a fair point, right? This was not a perfect solution to what happened, obviously, because 3 people still died. And so they'll focus on the violence that occurred before it was stopped. You saw that's what Giffords did, and that's eventually what I think you saw from Brady as well. Even though their president Chris Brown was initially implying that this was vigilantism, stopping the shooting. Later on, they put out a much softer statement about how it was good, but not a solution. But yeah, it's you still saw, Shannon Watts from Moms Demand Action falsely claiming this was illegal and really kind of attacking this kid for getting involved.
Sure. Yeah. And to the point of where the illegal trope comes from, I guess the mall apparently had a no weapons policy, which a lot of malls do, a lot of businesses do. And so for folks who don't know, when a private business has a policy like that, it depends on the state. Some states are different than others, but in this case, in Indiana, there's no force of law behind that sign. That doesn't make him a criminal for carrying on that property. Right. The only legality there would be if someone from the mall asked him to leave the property and he didn't, because he was carrying. Yeah.
Then he can be charged for trespass. It's they're very similar to like a no shirt, no shoes policy at a store.
Right. Exactly.
At like a convenience store. Like that's not illegal for you to go in there with no shirt on. If they ask you to leave though, and you don't, then you could be arrested for trespassing. Right. It's a store policy. It's not law. And I will say too, a lot of malls, they might have a policy about weapons somewhere in a fine print document, on their website or somewhere at the mall, but most of them don't do what you usually would see with no gun signs, which is to actually post them at every entrance. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen a mall that actually has the little, gun with a cross through it sign posted at their doors. So that, that's another issue with a lot of states require you to have clear postage on that issue. So we don't know what this Indiana mall actually did in practice, but regardless, as you said, it's not a crime.
And the fact that, as you said, the mall actually put out a statement and thanked him for doing what he did, kind of shows you where that's at. So obviously it kind
of makes you wonder why they have that policy. If that's how I feel.
One might wonder. Yeah, exactly. Because obviously the policy didn't stop the assailant from bringing his rifle in there. And thankfully the young man from Indiana brought his as well and was well trained with it. But just an interesting response to see, like you said, people instead of just taking the time to say, even if you're a gun control activist, even if you don't want to rely on armed civilians to handle situations like this, it's still a net benefit in this case that more people weren't killed because of someone's quick thinking. You can at least acknowledge that fact. So it's just bizarre to try to point out different ways that this guy might be a vigilante or breaking the law somehow.
Right. And I guess I should point out too that the attacker had 3 different guns on him and quite a lot more ammunition than what he ended up actually shooting. So it seems likely that he would have killed a lot more people had he not been shot by Dicken in this case. So I think it's fairly unquestionable at this point that he saved lives. As you note in your piece, does that mean that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun? Not necessarily, right? You went over some of the statistics and some of the things that have been pointed out at other media outlets, about active shooter situations and how frequently they're stopped with, by armed bystanders. Or to be fair, I think good guy with a gun, to me, also obviously implies police officer. When Wayne LaPierre made that quote, sure, he meant to include police officers. And so, there were 4 armed civilians that shot and killed an active shooter in 2021, according to the FBI. There were 14 more police officers who did the same, and then 30 more were arrested without being killed.
Right.
And so that's what that is. It's 40,
48, and the rest,
So,
the active shooter killed themselves before anyone could intervene.
Right. So out of the 61. The numbers are important to keep in mind. And yes, armed civilians are not the main way that an active shooting is brought to an end, but it does happen. And it certainly is possible. This is certainly not the first time it's happened. And it's unlikely to be the last time. And I think that's a more than legitimate point to make about the situation. Like, we want to be clear about the context and the numbers, but the idea that this does not happen or could not happen is something that has been put forward often by at least the more bombastic gun control activists out there. Are saying that. I mean, Uvalde was a great example of this. They said repeatedly that this disproves the idea of a good guy with a gun, because the police in Uvalde just did not intervene, which was never really a repudiation of the idea that someone could intervene or that the shooting could have been prevented or at least stopped before it got as far as it did. The attacker could have been stopped before he got as far as he did. But, in that case, that's incompetence or, mismanagement or just, to an absolutely egregious level, cowardice, whatever else you want to call what happened in Uvalde. It doesn't disprove the idea that somebody could take on an active shooter and stop them, as we saw in this Indiana mall shooting. And, you had a lot of talking points that were disproved, right? There's also there's a whole line of argument about how, because the shooter in Uvalde had an AR-15, that the gun was so scary to these cops that 400 of them couldn't intervene. And that number is not an exaggeration. The report came out recently that 400 police officers were on the scene of Robin Elementary School before they actually went in. The 4 officers actually went in to confront the shooter. But, here you have a situation is, again, a rifle. I believe it's an AR-15 has been the reports. And this was a 22-year-old civilian with a handgun,
right,
who took him on and ended the shooting.
That's right.
It's certainly not impossible. Not even the first time. Not even the first time in recent memory. There was also the West Virginia incident where somebody opened fire on a crowd of people at a park with an AR-15, and a woman with a concealed carry license fired back, killing the attacker without anyone else being harmed. So we don't need this mall shooting as an example, but it is exactly that. It's an example of this situation happening. It's not a myth. It's not made up. So I don't know, you have any final thoughts on that whole situation?
No, like you said, I think you pretty much covered it. Just the way that, especially this incident in particular, just really seemed to intersect with a lot of gun politics flashpoints. You had the permitless carry scenario because their policy just kicked into law. You have gun-free zones as a policy, obviously, when a place has a no weapons allowed sign, but obviously guns on both the good side and the bad guy side still showed up. And then, like you said, armed civilians defending against active shooters. It's just a really good example of the ways that these policies can work out in the real world. And in this case, fortunately, a young man was able to prevent further bloodshed. And so, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, too, that because of all of those intersections, that's why you saw such a strong negative reaction from some gun control advocates, some high profile ones, which later they perhaps realized were not the best takes or going to resonate very well with most people, because Shannon Watts deleted her tweet saying that what the shooter did was illegal, and Chris Brown from Brady eventually put out another statement that was much softer, that praised the reaction of the of Eli Dicken, but said it wasn't a good solution, which is a different debate, of course, and one that you covered pretty well in these pieces.